Hello there, and thank you for tuning in to another one of my stories. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Living here in Bangkok for the past 8 years, I've seen plenty of expats come and go, each with their own story to tell. Some find what they're looking for, others find something entirely different. Today, I want to share with you the story of my good friend Richard Thompson, a man whose search for healing led him down a path he never could have imagined. The first time I saw Richard break down and cry was in a dingy internet cafe on Sukhumvit Road at 3 in the morning. This wasn't tears of joy or relief. These were the tears of a man who had just discovered that everything he believed about love, trust, and human connection had been nothing more than an elaborate lie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all began. Richard Thompson was a decent man who made one terrible mistake. He fell in love with a ghost, a beautiful illusion crafted by someone who saw his loneliness from a mile away and decided to profit from it. What started as innocent therapeutic massages in a high-end spa became a financial nightmare that nearly destroyed him. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was how she made him believe that someone could love him again after his world had fallen apart. If this kind of story resonates with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. These are real stories from real people, and your support helps me continue sharing them. Richard was 55 when I first met him at Cheap Charlie's Bar in January of 2022. He'd been in Bangkok for exactly 3 weeks, and you could tell he was one of those guys who had never traveled much beyond package holidays to Spain. Everything about the city overwhelmed him, from the humid air that stuck to your skin to the organized chaos of the traffic. He was trying to order a beer in broken Thai, butchering every syllable, when I stepped in to help. That's how we became friends, over a shared laugh about the impossible tones of the Thai language. Richard had been an accountant for 32 years in Manchester, married to his childhood sweetheart Sarah for 28 years. They'd had a comfortable life, nothing spectacular but solid and predictable. 2 grown children who lived their own lives, a mortgage they'd nearly paid off, annual holidays to the same cottage in the Lake District. Then Sarah got sick. Pancreatic cancer, the doctors said. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. Richard held her hand as she died, whispered that he loved her, and then found himself completely alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. The grief counselor told him to travel, to experience something new. His sister suggested Thailand, said the change of scenery would do him good. Richard booked a flight to Bangkok with no real plan except to be somewhere that didn't remind him of Sarah. He rented a small apartment in the Thonglor district, nothing fancy but clean and quiet. For the first 2 weeks, he barely left his room except to buy food from the 7-Eleven downstairs. That's when the loneliness really started to eat at him. Richard had always been a physical person, not in a sexual way necessarily, but he needed human touch to feel connected. With Sarah, there had been hugs, casual touches while watching television, her hand in his during movies. Without that constant physical connection, he felt like he was disappearing. His sister had mentioned that Thai massage was supposed to be therapeutic, good for stress and muscle tension. So Richard started Googling spa recommendations, looking for something legitimate and professional. That's how he found the Lotus Blossom Wellness Center. Their website looked professional, with photos of serene treatment rooms and testimonials about healing and rejuvenation. The prices were reasonable but not suspiciously cheap. Most importantly, they offered traditional Thai massage, which Richard had read was more therapeutic than sensual. He booked an appointment for the following Tuesday, hoping that maybe some professional human contact would help ease the constant ache in his chest. The spa was located in a modern building near the Phrom Phong BTS station. Clean marble floors, soft lighting, the smell of jasmine and eucalyptus in the air. Richard filled out a brief medical history form and was led to a private room where he was told to change into loose cotton clothing. His therapist knocked gently on the door before entering. Her name was Mint, she said in accented but clear English. She was probably in her early 30s, petite with kind eyes and gentle hands. She asked about his stress levels, whether he had any injuries or sensitive areas. The massage itself was exactly what Richard needed. Mint worked methodically, using her elbows and knees to apply pressure to tight muscles he didn't even know he had. She was professional but warm, asking occasionally if the pressure was too much, explaining what she was doing and why. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, Richard felt his body truly relax. When the 90 minutes were over, he felt like a different person. More importantly, Mint had treated him like a human being, not just another customer. She'd listened when he mentioned being new to Bangkok, offered suggestions for restaurants and cultural sites he might enjoy. There was nothing inappropriate about their interaction, but Richard left feeling like he'd made a genuine connection with another person. That night, he slept better than he had in months. Richard started going to the Lotus Blossom twice a week. Always the same appointment time, always requesting Mint as his therapist. She remembered details from their previous conversations, asked about places he'd visited based on her recommendations. Slowly, she began sharing small details about her own life. She was from a small village in the north, sending money home to support her mother and younger sister. She was saving to eventually open her own spa somewhere more peaceful than Bangkok. After about 6 weeks, Mint suggested they meet for coffee after one of his appointments. Nothing romantic, she assured him, but she enjoyed their conversations and thought he might like to learn more about Thai culture from a local perspective. Richard agreed immediately. They went to a quiet cafe nearby where Mint told him about growing up in a farming family, about the sacrifices her parents had made to give her an education. Richard found himself sharing stories about Sarah, about the life they'd built together and how lost he felt without her. That coffee date became a regular thing. Then dinner occasionally. Mint showed Richard parts of Bangkok most tourists never see: small temples tucked away in residential neighborhoods, street food stalls where she'd grown up eating. She taught him basic Thai phrases and laughed gently when he mispronounced them. Richard started to feel like maybe he could build a new life, one where his past with Sarah was honored but didn't define everything about his future. The first red flag was so subtle that Richard missed it completely. During one of their dinners, Mint mentioned that her mother needed surgery for a heart condition. The procedure was expensive, more than Mint could afford on her spa salary, even with her savings. She wasn't asking for help, she said, just explaining why she seemed distracted lately. Richard, who had always been a problem solver, immediately offered to pay for the surgery. Mint protested that she couldn't accept such generosity from a friend, but Richard insisted. It was only $5,000, nothing compared to what her mother's health was worth. Mint was so grateful that she cried right there in the restaurant. She hugged Richard tightly, told him he was the kindest man she'd ever met. She promised to pay him back as soon as she could, though Richard told her not to worry about it. That night, she kissed him for the first time, soft and sweet outside his apartment building. Richard felt like his heart might burst with happiness. For the first time since Sarah died, he felt needed and appreciated. The surgery went well, according to Mint. Her mother was recovering, and the whole family was grateful to Richard for his help. Mint seemed lighter, happier. She started staying later when they went out, sometimes coming up to Richard's apartment for tea and conversation. Nothing physical happened beyond kissing and cuddling on his sofa while they watched movies, but Richard felt closer to her than he had to anyone in years. But then there was another crisis. Mint's sister had been accepted to university but couldn't afford the tuition. Mint was torn between her own dreams of opening a spa and helping her family. Again, Richard offered to help. University was an investment in the girl's future, he reasoned, and he had more than enough money in his retirement accounts, another $3,000. Mint was reluctant to accept, but Richard convinced her that this was what people who cared about each other did. The pattern was subtle at first: small emergencies, family obligations, opportunities that required just a little financial help. Richard never felt pressured. Mint always seemed genuinely distressed about asking, always promised to pay him back, always showed such gratitude that Richard felt like a hero. She introduced him to her friends as her boyfriend, brought him to social gatherings where everyone thanked him for taking such good care of Mint. He felt accepted, valued, part of a community for the first time since moving to Bangkok. 6 months into their relationship, Mint started talking about their future together. She wanted to open that spa she'd always dreamed of, and she'd found the perfect location. It would cost about $20,000 to lease and renovate the space, purchase equipment, and cover operating expenses for the first few months. She was almost embarrassed to mention it, she said, but she wondered if Richard might want to be her business partner. She'd pay him back with interest once the spa was profitable and they could build something together. Richard was hesitant about such a large amount, but Mint had an answer for everything. She'd done market research, had a solid business plan, even had potential clients lined up. She showed him the space, a lovely ground floor unit in a good neighborhood with plenty of parking. Richard could see how excited she was about the prospect, how much it meant to her to have control over her own career. And the idea of building something together, of having a shared future, was incredibly appealing. The spa opened 6 months later with a small celebration. Mint had worked tirelessly to create a beautiful professional space. She hired 2 other therapists, a receptionist, and a cleaning service. Richard was so proud watching her interact with clients, seeing her confidence and expertise in her element. The business seemed to be doing well with regular clients and positive reviews online. Richard felt like he'd made a real difference in someone's life, like his money had been put to good use. But as the months went by, the spa didn't seem to be generating the profits Mint had projected. There were always unexpected expenses, equipment that needed repair, marketing costs, staff issues. Mint was stressed and working long hours, often too tired to spend much time with Richard. When they did see each other, she was usually worried about money, about keeping the business afloat during the slow season. Richard found himself contributing more and more to keep the spa running. A few $100s for new linens, $1,000 for a broken air conditioning unit, $2,000 for a marketing campaign. Each request came with detailed explanations, receipts, and profuse gratitude. Mint never demanded anything, but Richard could see how much he was struggling and he wanted to help. He'd already invested so much in their shared dream that it seemed foolish to let it fail for lack of a few thousand more dollars. The requests became more frequent and larger. Staff salaries, rent increases, equipment upgrades, insurance payments. Richard started dipping into his pension funds, liquidating investments he'd been saving for his own retirement. He told himself it was temporary, that once the spa was established and profitable, he'd see a return on his investment. Mint was always so appreciative, so loving, so committed to making their business succeed. I started getting concerned about Richard around this time. We'd meet for drinks maybe once a week, and he always looked tired, stressed in a way that hadn't been there when he first arrived in Bangkok. He talked constantly about the spa, about Mint's hard work and dedication, but I noticed he never mentioned any profits or returns on his investment. When I asked directly about the business's financial health, Richard got defensive, insisting that all new businesses took time to become profitable. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you're finding this story engaging. And I'm curious, have any of your friends or family ever been in situations where love and money became dangerously intertwined? Leave a comment and let me know. The truth started to unravel in the most mundane way possible. Richard was at the spa one afternoon having his regular massage appointment when he overheard Mint talking to another client in rapid Thai. He'd been taking language lessons for months by this point and understood more than most people realized. The client was asking about booking regular appointments, and Mint was explaining that she wasn't actually a licensed massage therapist, that she just worked there part-time for extra money. Her real job was in customer service for a telecommunications company. Richard was confused. He waited until after his appointment to ask Mint about what he'd heard, thinking maybe he'd misunderstood the conversation. But Mint's reaction told him everything he needed to know. She looked panicked for just a split second before recovering and explaining that she'd been joking with the client, that of course she was a real therapist. But Richard had seen that flash of fear in her eyes, and suddenly other things started making sense. He began paying closer attention to details he'd previously ignored. The spa's website listed Mint as the owner, but when he looked more carefully at the business registration document she'd shown him, her name wasn't anywhere to be found. The other therapist treated her like an employee, not an owner. Clients made appointments through a central booking system, not directly with Mint. The financial statements she'd been showing him had no official letterhead, no accountant's signature, no way to verify their authenticity. Richard started doing his own investigation, something he should have done months earlier. The business license for the spa was registered to a company he'd never heard of. The lease agreement he'd helped pay for didn't have Mint's name on it anywhere. When he went to the spa unannounced one Tuesday morning, Mint wasn't there. The receptionist said she only worked Thursdays through Sundays and only part-time. That's when Richard realized he'd been living in a fantasy. The woman he thought he was building a life with, the business partner he'd invested his retirement savings in, the relationship he'd believed was leading toward marriage and a shared future in Thailand, none of it was real. Mint wasn't a struggling entrepreneur trying to build something with the man she loved. She was an employee at a spa, probably working with others who had identified him as a lonely, vulnerable foreigner with money to spare. The confrontation happened on a rainy Thursday evening at their usual restaurant. Richard laid out everything he'd discovered, calmly but firmly. Mint's response was to cry, to insist that she'd never lied to him, that there had been misunderstandings but that her feelings were real. She said she'd been trying to protect him from the complicated business arrangements, that she hadn't wanted to burden him with details that didn't matter. But Richard wasn't the same naive man who'd arrived in Bangkok a year earlier. He'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine emotion and performance. He asked for documentation, for proof that his money had actually gone where she claimed it had. He wanted to see bank statements, receipts, contracts, anything that would verify her story. Mint became angry then, accused him of not trusting her, of treating their relationship like a business transaction instead of a love story. That night, Richard went home alone and did something he should have done months earlier. He called the spa directly and asked to speak to the owner. The actual owner was a middle-aged Thai man named Somchai, who confirmed that Mint was just a part-time employee. She'd never been involved in any business partnership, never had access to company finances, never been authorized to negotiate on behalf of the spa. When Richard explained the situation, Somchai was genuinely surprised and concerned. He'd had no idea that one of his employees was conducting personal business using the spa's reputation. The money was gone. All of it. Nearly $60,000 that Richard had given to Mint over the course of their relationship, supposedly for family emergencies and business investments, had disappeared into accounts he'd never seen and purposes he couldn't verify. Mint stopped answering his calls and texts. When he went to the spa looking for her, the staff said she no longer worked there. Her social media profiles disappeared. The phone number he'd been using to contact her was suddenly disconnected. Richard tried going to the police, but they were polite but unhelpful. He had no proof of fraud, they explained. He'd voluntarily given money to someone he was in a relationship with. There were no contracts, no formal business agreements, no evidence that Mint had explicitly lied about her intentions. It was a civil matter, they said, not a criminal one. His only recourse would be to hire a lawyer and try to sue for recovery, but even then, his chances of success were minimal. That's when Richard had his breakdown at the internet cafe. He'd spent hours trying to track down any trace of Mint online, searching for her real name, her address, any way to contact her or recover his money. He found nothing. It was like she'd never existed. Sitting there at 4 in the morning, surrounded by the sounds of online gaming and the smell of instant noodles, Richard finally accepted that he'd been completely and thoroughly scammed by someone who'd never felt anything real for him at all. The worst part wasn't the money, though losing his retirement savings was devastating. The worst part was the realization that every moment of happiness he'd felt over the past year had been based on lies. Every conversation, every kiss, every plan they'd made together had been part of an elaborate performance designed to separate him from his money. The woman he'd thought he was falling in love with didn't exist. She was a character played by someone who saw him as nothing more than a source of income. Richard spiraled into a depression deeper than anything he'd experienced, even after Sarah's death. At least his grief for his wife had been clean, honest, based on real love and real loss. This was different. This was shame and humiliation mixed with genuine heartbreak. He'd been foolish, naive, desperate enough for connection that he'd ignored obvious warning signs. He'd betrayed Sarah's memory by falling for someone who'd never cared about him at all. For weeks, Richard barely left his apartment. He stopped eating regular meals, stopped showering regularly, stopped returning calls from his children back in England. I'd check on him occasionally, bringing food and trying to get him to talk about what had happened. He was embarrassed to admit the full extent of the scam, how much money he'd lost, how completely he'd been deceived. He felt like a stereotypical foolish old man who'd been taken advantage of by a beautiful young woman, exactly the kind of person other expats whispered about in bars. The turning point came when Richard's daughter Emma called me directly, worried because she hadn't heard from her father in over a week. I had to tell her what had happened, gently but honestly. Emma flew to Bangkok immediately, and seeing her father's condition shocked her into action. She didn't lecture him or make him feel worse about his mistakes. Instead, she helped him start putting his life back together piece by piece. Emma stayed for 2 weeks, helping Richard organize his finances, contact his bank about potential fraud protection, and connect with support groups for people who'd been victims of romance scams. She also helped him find a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, someone who could help him work through not just the financial loss but the emotional betrayal he'd experienced. The therapy was harder than Richard expected. He had to confront not just his own vulnerability and poor judgment, but also the grief and loneliness that had made him susceptible to manipulation in the first place. He'd never properly processed Sarah's death, never learned how to be alone without feeling desperate for connection. His therapist helped him understand that his desire for love and companionship wasn't wrong, but that he'd been so afraid of being alone that he'd ignored his own instincts about mince behavior. Slowly, Richard began to rebuild his life on more solid ground. He joined a support group for widowed men where he could talk about his grief for Sarah without feeling like he was bothering people. He started volunteering at a local charity that helped street dogs, which gave him purpose and regular human interaction without the pressure of romantic relationships. He began taking Thai language classes at a legitimate school where he made friends with other expats who were also learning to navigate life in a foreign country. The financial recovery was more difficult. Richard had lost most of his retirement savings, money he couldn't easily replace at his age. He had to completely revise his plans for the future, accepting that he might need to work longer than he'd hoped or live more modestly than he'd planned. But with Emma's help, he was able to consolidate his remaining assets and create a realistic budget that would allow him to stay in Thailand if he wanted to, just with a simpler lifestyle. More importantly, Richard learned to trust his instincts again. He realized that he'd ignored dozens of warning signs during his relationship with Mint, from the constant financial emergencies to the way she'd deflected his questions about the spa's operations. He'd wanted so desperately to believe in their relationship that he'd dismissed his own doubts and the concerns of friends like me who'd tried to warn him. Richard's story isn't unique, unfortunately. Romance scams targeting older, recently widowed or divorced men are incredibly common, especially in countries like Thailand, where the power dynamics between locals and wealthy foreigners create opportunities for exploitation. The scammers are often sophisticated, working in teams, with carefully crafted personas designed to appeal to their targets' specific vulnerabilities. What made Richard's situation particularly painful was how real his feelings were. He wasn't just looking for sex or companionship. He was genuinely trying to build a new life with someone he thought cared about him. Mint had been skilled enough to create moments of genuine seeming intimacy to make Richard feel valued and needed in ways he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The betrayal cut so deep because the emotions involved were authentic, even if they were only coming from one side. Today, almost 2 years later, Richard is doing much better. He's still in Bangkok, but he's built a life based on genuine relationships and realistic expectations. He's in a book club with other expats, volunteers regularly at the animal shelter, and has even started dating again, very cautiously and with much better boundaries. He's learned that healing from grief doesn't require finding someone to replace what he's lost, but rather learning to build a new identity that honors his past while embracing his future. The money he lost to Mint is gone forever, but Richard has found something more valuable: the ability to trust himself again. He knows now that his desire for love and connection isn't something to be ashamed of, but it's also not something that should override his common sense and self-preservation instincts. He's learned to enjoy being alone without being lonely, to seek out genuine connections without being desperate for them. Richard's story is a reminder that love and loneliness can make us vulnerable to people who don't have our best interests at heart. It's also a reminder that recovery from betrayal is possible, that we can learn from our mistakes without being defined by them. The shame and humiliation that Richard felt were real and valid, but they didn't have to be permanent. With help, support, and time, he was able to rebuild his life on a foundation of self-respect and genuine relationships. If you've made it this far in the story, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. These stories matter because they remind us that we're all capable of both tremendous vulnerability and remarkable resilience. Have you or someone you know ever experienced a romance scam or similar betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember that healing is possible, that mistakes don't define us, and that genuine connection is still worth seeking, just with better boundaries and more awareness. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.